Hi, Neha. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us about this paper, List Now or Later, an equilibrium analysis of advanced booking platforms. So the title is very intriguing, and before I get you to explain the title, so when I read the paper, right, and when of course I've been working with you on this paper, broadly the domain that this belongs to is the domain of revenue management and pricing, right? And now I see that there are some very interesting nuances about this paper itself and its positioning vis-a-vis what is already known in the space of RM and pricing and the types of models that have been built, and also about the nature of the industry that this problem tends to tackle, right? So, I mean, things have moved from traditional, airlines and hotel bookings and car rentals to now platforms where, there are two-sided platforms and matching markets that exist. So, can you quickly, help us understand the positioning of this work and what is this interesting question that you are trying to answer?
Traditionally in the RM literature, there's been a lot of work, and typically that looks at this central entity that controls all the assets and how they get priced and sold to customers over time. And typically the theme that comes through is that the platform would charge the highest price to customers who can pay for it, and typically try to sell most of its asset in that period. Now that in the newer setting, in the newer world, we have these two-sided marketplaces where there is no central entity controlling these assets, but there are these independent asset owners who show up to provide assets to people who need them. And now, obviously, a lot of these platforms can differ along multiple dimensions in terms of what they control operationally. So, platforms like Uber are controlling the pricing. Platforms like Airbnb don't control even that, but they allow customers to book in advance. And there are various dimensions along which these platforms differ, but the key way these platforms differ from the traditional setting is that they are uncapacitated. So the capacity is truly endogenous to the pricing or other market forces in that particular system.
Yeah, that helps me, understand at least the key differentiator over here. But in this, new world, this e-commerce world, this platform world, right? How do the two entities, the hosts, as you call them in the paper, the suppliers of the asset, and the customers who are demanding the use, the service from the asset, how do they benefit in this case, and what is the role that the platform then plays? As you said, I mean, it could be pricing, but that is about what price will the customer get the asset for, but what's in it for the hosts or the listers of the asset?
Yeah. So typically in these platforms, the platform is choosing the price that the customers pay to rent the asset, but how they try to tie up the suppliers in the system is typically by providing them a fixed rate or the fixed fraction of this price as revenue to the supplier. So platform typically keeps some commission for itself, which could be 20 to 30%, and passes on the rest of the percentage as the revenue for the supplier. Now, this has worked very well in platforms like Uber, where there are drivers thinking about, do they want to drive right now or not? And when typically there is surge pricing, we see a lot more drivers in the system come in because they are incentivized by the higher price in the platform. Now, in this paper, what we are going to talk about is the fact that the suppliers are not really thinking about just this one decision, whether they want to give their asset on rent or not, but they're also thinking about when do they want to commit to providing these assets. And this decision becomes more nuanced or more important because they don't control the prices on the platform in any way. So the prices are controlled by the platform, and therefore this decision is what we see is being made by the
So
suppliers.
that's an interesting, distinction that you're making. You're saying that the hosts who are actually putting out their asset for rental, in an Uber kind of setting, they would only do it when there is a demand because they can wait that long. Whereas what you're saying is that there are these other asset sharing platforms where the listers have to make this decision well in advance, right? As to one, should I list this asset on this platform at all or not? And then when should I make it available for renting based on some anticipated price that I would get at that point in time, and the revenue share. Okay, so that kind of explains this title of yours. This is saying that list now or later, which is the trade-off that the hosts are facing, and an equilibrium analysis of the advanced booking. The advanced booking meaning that there are customers or renters who benefit from having access to the assets earlier on because they probably have a larger planning horizon and would like to get a booking done earlier rather than just before they intend to use this trend, right? So there is this tension on both sides of this. Great. So if you can now help me understand, right? So beyond this, that the company that you worked for, and this was a large, car asset sharing platform in India in an emerging economy, right? The data that you had, did it actually show this kind of behavior on the part of the hosts and the customers?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was the genesis or the motivation for this paper as well. So, what we saw in the data was that broadly they would see these two types of customers. One that like the certainty of having booked their assets in advance. So, they would typically show up much before when they actually need the asset to book the asset with this platform. And then there would always be some people who make plans on a Friday just to have a long drive on the weekend, so they would show only on the Fridays. So there's clear segregation between the two types of customers that we saw. But what was also interesting to see is that as we saw that these hosts of the cars, these car owners who are supplying their asset, as they have more and more experience of listing in this platform, they started committing later and later. And what I mean by that is, if earlier they would tell 2 months in advance that their car is available at some point in time, then as they spend more time in the platform, they learn more about the demand. They were telling the platform or listing very close to their assets availability, maybe just 2 days in advance when the asset is actually available. And this really tied into one possible explanation, and that we are exploring in this paper, is that because the platform tied these suppliers to the prices it was charging the customers through these simple revenue sharing or the commission rate contracts, what is really happening is that the suppliers or these hosts, they become very smart over time, and they learn that the people or the customers who book just in time for their assets are typically charged a higher price. And since they just get a fixed cut or a fixed fraction of that price, it's better to come later. So they are doing exactly what in a typical RM one would expect them to do, that they are coming in to serve the customers which are getting charged the highest price.
What's wrong with that, right? I mean, from a host's perspective, it makes a lot of sense to wait till you get the largest price and then put your car or list your car at that point in time. Where does this role of capacity come in, and how does that moderate this whole dynamics, and why is it lesser revenue? One would expect this should actually be higher revenue for everyone, right?
Yeah.
But what happens?
So what exactly is the difference from these uncapacitated compared to these typical RM or these models that we have seen? Is what happens is, when all of these suppliers together start chasing that high price in the end, what they need to sort of understand is the following. Nobody is listing their assets early on. So when these advanced booking customers or customers who want to book their assets very early on, when they show up in the system, they see no cars available. So they lost out on the opportunity to serve one part of this population, which is this advanced booking customers. So from a platform's perspective, that's really bad because there's a service breakdown for a part of your customer population. But on the other hand, it's not even good from a pure revenue maximization perspective, because when everybody starts dumping their supply in anticipation of a higher price, the platform is just doing dynamic pricing. So even though the demand is higher of these advanced or just-in-time booking customers, the price just went down because everybody started supplying their assets in that for those customers.
Okay, so what you're pointing to is that the fact that there is no capacity control in these kinds of markets, right? The prices will actually sometimes drop because there is a glut of supply when the demand surges, because supply tries to beat up to demand, and everybody loses. Because and you observe this in the data. So just can you quickly give me a sense of the size of the data and what kind of hypotheses did you test and what empirics did you actually utilize to get to these answers?
So we were in collaboration with this large car sharing platform in India where we have 2 years worth of data starting from 2021, 2022, where they have these kind of supplier base. From the customer's perspective, the result that we have around this service breakdown or lower service opportunity for these advanced booking customers, we actually find in the data that the people who like booking in advance, they have up to 60% lesser options available to them compared to the people who come very, very close to when they need service.
So in a sense, while your hypotheses panned out and you were able to establish them, when I read the paper, then you get into a whole bunch of analytical modeling, right? And what were you trying to achieve through this analytical modeling, and why, and the kind of methodology that you bring to bear, right? Can you quickly tell us a little bit about the hard research questions now that you were going to answer? Because the data was showing you something, was showing you that there is this kind of strategic behavior and there is this lost sales but then you wanted to now use this fact to start doing analytical modeling. So what were the specific then research questions that you were going to answer, and what methodology did you bring to bear to answer those questions?
So as the data from this company showed us that these hosts are strategic in nature, they are not just deciding whether they want to rent their asset, but when they want to rent their asset. So a natural methodology that emerges is to look at a game theoretic analysis where all these agents, the customers and the suppliers and the platform is supposed to be strategic in nature. So what we did was, let's say I would look at a particular date or time, and I would say that there are two booking windows in which customers can arrive. Either they can arrive early or they can arrive later, which is closer to the time they need the service. And now I basically model these suppliers as making two decisions. One, whether they want to rent their asset, and two, whether they want to supply in period 1 or in period 2. So when are they listing? That's the decision. And depending on the supply and demand that happens in any given point of time, the platform is going to decide the price to balance out the demand and the supply. Right. And we analyze this game where obviously the supply shows up, then there's demand that realizes, and then the platform is posting the price.
And the specific question that you were trying to answer through this game theoretic modeling was?
So we were trying to look at, given that these hosts are strategic, and given that they are being compensated by these simple revenue sharing contracts, what are the implications on the service and the pricing for the platform? In the data, we were seeing 60% lesser availability of assets for the advanced booking customers. Can we actually find some support in theory for that?
Okay.
And then building on to that and saying, okay, if there are certain implications, what could be a better way of resolving these issues?
Right. So you were able to corroborate your findings from the data through this analytical modeling itself, right? But analytical models, right? I mean, when people look at them, they always worry about, oh, was this assumption right? Was this done for analytical ease? Was it or tractability of your model? So a lot of these questions and assumptions come into play, right? How do you deal with those, and how do you make sure that whatever is coming through to corroborating your findings from the data, right? How do you test, for a lack of a better word, in the robustness of your results or your analytical findings?
Yeah, so I think the main assumptions, we were very careful to make sure that the assumptions are somehow coming from the data. So the assumptions like the host making these strategic choices of when to commit, the customers being of two types. But really, what we tested for is trying to vary these demand distributions and trying to look at what do suppliers believe or these hosts think about what the demand is, because there can be a significant information asymmetry in what the supplier thinks the demand distribution looks like. And in the model, we test for this assumption. So when we, in fact, what we interestingly observe is as they have more and more information asymmetry about what the actual demand distribution looks like, this region of service breakdown for the advanced booking customers becomes even worse. So the region that we are claiming to exist, in fact, grows when we account for some of the tweaks in these assumptions.
Okay, so so if I were to understand the implication, what you're showing is while maybe a slice of what is happening, they actually are strengthened and may actually even get worse if the assumptions were relaxed.
Yes.
Would
Yes.
that be a fair characterization
Yeah.
of the robustness that you
Right.
have? But then so what, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
sure, so your analytical model works, you have all of this, but from a business standpoint or a managerial implication standpoint, what is it that then you are able to capture? In particular, I want to understand how should they change it, or what is the implication of your results for the managers?
So right off the bat, even if I look at this service breakdown, one implication that is very clear for a practitioner seems to be that the platforms can benefit by sharing demand information with their hosts.
Okay.
Because when hosts know about this demand better, this region of service breakdown shrinks. But that's true even if the platform wants to go ahead and implement just these simple revenue sharing contracts. But what they could also do, and what we show is to be optimal, is they could implement something like a constant fee or a constant wage type of a contract, wherein the platform goes ahead and says, look, if you give me your asset, I'm going to match it with some customer. But irrespective of the price I charge to the customer, you are just going to get $200. So if such a contract of constant fee to the supplier is implemented, it takes away the supplier or the host's incentive to basically be strategic about when he wants to commit. So now he has all the incentive to commit as soon as possible. He knows that his asset is available for rent. So that we show is optimal in certain
just
settings.
to understand this better, while the lure of making more money is gone, the chances that my asset will be rented have increased, and that sort of compensates me. So it's also good for me as a host. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, because now as a host, all I care about is getting matched to a customer because I am going to get these $200 irrespective. So now my whole objective is to make sure some customer sees my asset being listed and then books it. So I have an incentive now to tell the platform as early as possible. But as you can see, a platform can get into trouble because if people's opportunity cost of providing the asset becomes very high, $200 is not a good enough money I can pay them to provide me with their assets. So what we find is that if this opportunity cost is high, clearly this wage idea is probably very expensive for the platform to implement. So what could be another option is this idea of differential revenue sharing contracts, wherein what the platform says is that if you commit very early as a supplier or a host, I'm going to give you 80% of the price that I'm charging the customer. But if you commit very, very late, I'm going to give you only 65% or 70% of the price that I'm charging the customer. So in that sense, I'm trying to incentivize the supplier or the host to list early.
So you're saying that somehow this listing decision needs to be tied into the incentive that is being provided, and if that can be done in a smart way, then one could mitigate this challenge that. And does the platform gain, or?
Yes. This is actually revenue maximizing. It's a win-win because the platform gains and the suppliers are better off.
Okay, so and you actually show that analytically in this paper. Question, right? I mean, do you see this in the industry? Have forms of this kind of a contract been used?
So far we are in the stages of implementing these type of supply contracts with our collaborator, but I guess they do see the value in this constant wage because we presented that to their data science team, and in the initial simulation result, it seems like that could benefit them a lot by just paying their suppliers or these hosts a constant fee, irrespective of. Yeah.
So Neha, I'm glad to hear that you're able to test some of these theoretical results that you have in practice, and also maybe experiment and find out whether they really work. But a natural question would be that how would one extend this research, right? And I remember earlier you mentioned that you had this contract that was the best contract that you had found, but of course under certain assumptions that you had already built in the way you built your models, right? But if one were to completely unconstrain that and figure out other ways, how would you extend this work?
Yeah, so obviously the contract that we are designing for, be it a constant wage or a differential revenue share, that's true for the model that we have built under these assumptions of a linear demand function and so on. Extending this work, I think what is really interesting to understand is what are the other levers the platform can use to probably maximize their revenue if they don't want to get into these other supply shaping contracts. So one way could be the way Airbnb is doing it, by giving the pricing power to the host. Now, obviously, the open question in that is that clearly it would take away the incentive from the host to be strategic about when to commit, because they could just fluctuate the pricing. But is that going to be necessarily revenue and welfare maximizing for the platform and the host? That's an open question. And that is definitely one of the directions we could take our research in. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Neha, for talking to us about this paper. And,
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.